Memory is an important resource that must be managed carefully. In this video, we will look at how the operating system manages memory. That is, how the operating system manages the RAM present in the system. Main memory and registers are the only storage entities that the CPU can access directly. So, any program to be executed must be brought into the main memory. Multiple processes should be loaded into the main memory in order to execute in parallel. What we are going to see is how the operating system manages memory such that it would allow multiple processes to execute almost simultaneously in a system. The goal of memory management is to allocate available memory efficiently to multiple processes. The main functions are to keep track of the used and unused part of the memory, allocate the necessary amount of memory needed to execute a process, deallocate memory when the process finishes execution, protect against unauthorized access, and simulate the existence of larger memory. Let us first see what is a physical address and a logical address. The main memory is organized as an array of contiguous byte-sized cells. Each cell has a unique address called physical address. The simplest way for a CPU to access a memory location is to place a physical address on the address line known as physical addressing. Earlier PCs used physical addressing. However, modern processors designed for general purpose computation uses a form of addressing known as virtual addressing or logical addressing. The logical address does not exist physically. It only gives a reference to the physical address. With virtual address, the address generated by the CPU is virtual address or logical address. The virtual address is then converted to physical address in order to access the memory location. The hardware part that converts the virtual address to physical address is known as memory management unit. Now, let us discuss about the various memory allocation techniques. In contiguous allocation, each process is allocated a single contiguous chunk of memory. That means the physical address space is contiguous. In non-contiguous allocation, parts of a process can be allocated non-contiguous chunks of memory. The process is split into different blocks and the blocks loaded into the memory need not to be adjacent. The physical address space need not to be contiguous in this case. Let us discuss about the contiguous allocation techniques. Contiguous allocation is the allocation technique that is used in earlier computers. Single partition allocation is one of the earlier simplest memory management approach. In single partition allocation, memory is conceptually divided into two sections, one for the operating system and one for the user process. This type of organization allows only one process in memory at a time. That is, only one process can be executed at a time. The second process is loaded by overwriting the first one. The user process may not use the whole user area, hence there may be unused space. This type of organization is easy to implement. However, it results in lower utilization of CPU and memory since it does not support multiprogramming. In multiple partition allocation, multiple partitions are created to allow multiple user processes to be resident in memory simultaneously. Depending upon how and when the partitions are created, there are two types of partitioning: fixed partition or static partition and variable partition or dynamic partition. In fixed partition, main memory is divided into different partitions and the size and the number of partitions remains fixed. Each partition can hold one process at a time. When a process arrives, it is put into a partition that is large enough to hold it. When a process finishes execution, the partition becomes available for another process. Assume that the memory is partitioned as shown here. One partition is for the operating system and the other partitions are for the user processes. Consider the set of processes with the size as shown here. P1 is allocated to partition with size 25K. Although P1 requires only 20K, the entire 25K is allocated to P1 since the partition is fixed. P2 will be allocated to the next partition. P3 will be allocated to partition with size 100K. P4 will be allocated to the last partition. Fixed partitioning is simple to implement, allows multi-programming and little overhead to the operating system. The main disadvantage of fixed partitioning is inefficient use of memory due to internal fragmentation. Since the size of the partition is fixed, allocated memory may be larger than the requested memory. This is known as internal fragmentation since the memory is wasted within the partition. Memory that is internal to a partition but is not being used. In our example, process P1 requires only 20K, but 25K is allocated to P1, hence 5K is unused in the partition. This is known as internal fragmentation. In fixed partitioning, it is unable to run a program larger than the partition size. In earlier systems, programmers used a method known as overlays to solve this problem. A large program would be split by the programmer into pieces known as overlays. Overlays are created in such a way that no two overlays are needed needed at the same time in the memory. Only one overlay that is currently needed will be kept in the memory. All others are kept in secondary storage and is loaded as and when needed. Loading an overlay overrides the previously loaded overlay with the same load origin. That is, it will be loaded to the same address space of the previous one. The swapping of overlays is done by the operating system, but the splitting is the responsibility of the programmer. In fixed partitioning, the degree of multi-programming is fixed since the number of partitions that determines the number of active processes is fixed. To overcome some of the difficulties with fixed partitioning, another approach known as variable partition or dynamic partitioning was developed. In dynamic partitioning, the size and the number of partitions are decided during runtime by the operating system. When a process is brought into the memory, it is allocated exactly as much as it requires and not more. The part of the memory that is not allocated is called a hole. Consider a set of processes with the memory requirements as shown here. Assume that 56K memory is free. That means the whole size is 56K. Allocate memory to P1. P1 requires 20K. Hence 20K of memory is allocated to P1. Remaining 36K is free now. Allocate 14K to P2. Remaining 22K is free. Allocate 18K to P3. Remaining 4K is free. P4 requires 12K of memory. However, the whole size is only 4K. Hence, we cannot allocate memory to P4. P4 has to wait till enough memory gets free. Assume that P1 terminates. When P1 terminates, it leaves behind a hole of 20K. 12K can be allocated to P4, leaving behind a hole of 8K. Now, total 12K is free. However, we cannot allocate memory for P5 since the memory available is not contiguous. P5 has to wait till contiguous 12K of memory is available. Advantages of variable partitioning are simple to implement and it facilitates multi-programming. No internal fragmentation as partitions are created dynamically and each process is loaded into a partition of exactly the same size as that process. The main disadvantage of variable partitioning is external fragmentation. External fragmentation exists when sufficient free memory to satisfy a request exists but is not contiguous. That is, the memory is fragmented into small holes. As we have seen in the example, 12K is free but it cannot be allocated to P5 since the memory is available as two non-contiguous holes of 8K and 4K. This problem of creating unusable memory blocks outside the allocated partition is called external fragmentation. Compaction is a solution for external fragmentation. Compaction is a process of shuffling the memory contents to place all the free memory together in one large block. For example, using compaction, 8K and 4K can be merged together to form a whole of 12K using compaction. Now, this hole can be allocated to P5. Coalescing holes is the process of merging adjacent holes to form a single large hole. For example, here 12K and 4K can be coalesced to form a single hole of 26K. Let us continue the discussion on memory management in the next video.